Greetings, ladies and metal-gents, and welcome to Slate's edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Cursed Mortals, written by Dark Prince 010. Have you seen the news yet? Karras shook his head and stood to come and see the monitor, and stretching luxuriously as he did so. He could feel a number of stiff vertebrae in his spine crack, and he grimaced at the pain but smiled, knowing that small discomforts would mean much less pain later from the build-up of pressure in his joints. It had been a stretch that he had taken an entire year to perfect some centuries ago, and he had surprised even himself with how quickly he had picked it up and managed to perfect the action with little to no wasted movement or exertion. His spine followed mathematically beautiful ratios before he finished the stretch, coming to stand behind his mate and look at the boxy monitor. Feck pointed to part of the flickering screen, and he could see that the article was a news piece about a newly discovered humans. He was surprised that they had gained so much noteworthiness, for they were some of the unfortunate species of sentience cursed with mortality. They were little more than furless bipedal mammals, scarcely evolved beyond lactating, hooting at each other, and fighting in the mud with pointed sticks. In fact, their entire genus hadn't even existed for a clean million years as of the current date, whereas Feck Yea and Karras' kind can actually count their ancestors back to the formation and cooling of their planet nearly 10 billion years ago. With some amusement, Karras saw that he was nearly as old as the very planet humans called home, their star being a late bloomer in the celestial sense, and everything following being likewise delayed. Indeed, he almost felt a degree of pity for the simple creatures. Such limited lifespans were mere fractions of a blink of a cosmic eye. The scant handfuls of other sentient species and civilizations that littered the universe, of course, varied significantly in their form, function, and longevity. But even the most fleeting of those Karras had heard of at least counted their lifespans in dozens of centuries. The humans, however, were a mere fraction of that, and it surprised Karras to no end that they had made a civilization at all, let alone achieve spaceflight and interstellar travel. There had even been some murmurings here and there by those who had met the humans and seen some of their culture, that their species was capable of producing not just quality goods, but quality art as well. The notion was patently ridiculous, of course. The development of talent, true talent, took dozens of centuries for even the most menial and trivial passion, to say nothing of more noble and historied works like carving, textiles, or paintings. The thought reminded him. Karras stepped over to his latest carving and worked on it for a few days to clear his head before further trying to understand what he was reading. Pondering the article Feck Yea had opened, he could see that it spoke of humans not just in a curious tone, but in one filled with frustration and anger. Evidently, the humans had colonized a series of empty planetoids that had been identified as being rich in some much-needed minerals for Starship hyperjump shielding. Unfortunately, the humans were unwilling to see reason, claiming that because they had landed on, lived, and reproduced on the surface of a mere millennium, they were entitled to set terms for any negotiations regarding what lay poorly utilized and underappreciated below their feet. Feck Yea returned from the weeding of her arboretum that evening, seeing Karras still heading through, and chuckled. "Yes, I'm personally coming to the conclusion that we may have been overly hasty in asking for their input at all," she said, pointing to a sentence a few paragraphs down that Karras had not yet reached. "They seem to recognize and appreciate the density of titanium, but claim that they have no need for it for jump shielding." Karras blinked, stunned for a moment before he burst out laughing. "Evidently, they have some desire to put a dent in that seemingly boundless well of very productive capacity," he said. "The radiation from one triple load would surely sterilize any of the dumb bipeds, to say nothing of the various cancers that they would be inviting upon their heads after a few additional trips." Feck Yea shrugged, blinked at the rising binary suns in her eyes. "Yes, well, I guess they see life as more expendable than even we would have guessed," she said, as she picked a sprouting clump of soil out from under a claw. "The last bits of the report indicate the humans have threatened combat would be continued with hostilities, but their ships are something built in apparently not even a full human lifetime. The battles will likely be more a matter of swatting some belligerent gnats than a true competition." Karras nodded, turning back to begin truly focusing on his carving. He'd spent nearly 1,000,000 years honing his skills on this art form and was barely a score of millennia outside of his apprenticeship classes. But he still believed that he had some minor improvements to go before perfecting his art to stand amongst the masters of carving amongst his kind. Garrus had worked with this particular block of soapstone for nearly a decade already, here and there carving in and out, but he believed that he'd finally begun to achieve the final stages of details as its avian form became more recognizable. Although he was not finished yet, the piece was a constant source of praise for his efforts from all who visited. True, it might not be up to the level of the oldest masters at this point, but it was at least recognized as being among the best of a dozen or so living sculptors across their species, and annoyingly crowded field due to its popularity. He lifted each chisel and, over the course of a day, gently scraped off another flake. He'd barely been carving at it for another year before Kelsey's computer let out an insistent beep, alerting her that the digital courier had arrived with news update. Both Garrus and his mate were surprised at another news release so soon, but he could already feel shock rippling through him as his eyes took in the headline and the ominous map beneath it. Humans strike back after mining rig defense, inflict heavy casualties on both personnel and holdings. Long days passed as they stood in shock. Garrus could feel his anxiety rising. Death was a rare and celebrated thing for his species, with lives cut short prematurely due to accidents or violence mourned to the utmost. And yet here were the names of hundreds of lives lost, enough to depopulate entire planets, all just because some lowly humans had decided not to cooperate. It was stunning to see as well, the map revealing the holdings the humans had taken, springing forward like a wildfire from the mere arms of their home galaxy to now nearly half a dozen galaxies, almost all of which shared a border with Garrus's people. It was a surprise move, to be sure, but Garrus felt only a small pang of anxiety threatened to creep over him as he looked to find where the maps and the contested galaxies the world beneath their feet lay. Theirs was a fairly urbanized world. There were more than a dozen families on this continent, and twice that number scattered amongst the large islands in the planet's oceans. However, it did lie on the far tip of the galaxy that itself was nestled tens of thousands of light years away from the contested border. "I expect they will get what's coming to them," Kelsey said with a derisive snort. "They no doubt mobilized a fleet, and will soon be showing the humans why slapdash shipbuilding in less than a century is a great way to waste resources and lives alike." Garrus nodded, but couldn't help but wonder what the humans might do if they were not brought to heel quickly. The next week, he awoke from a fitful sleep and began returning to his carving to try steady his mind. He began to imagine that all was well after a month passed, and then another. But at the beginning of the third, there was another chime that made him and Kelsey jump when the midday meal. Cautiously, she opened the message to find a text-only warning from the provisional government of their small world, a household of bureaucrats and number counters who lived just a few hundred kilometers from where Garrus currently sat. It had been nearly 1,000 years since they had last needed to send any messages, but this time their eyes were wide and panicked as they called. "The humans have reached our galaxy," one voice said, gesturing to an updated map. To Garrus's concerns, the humans were showing as holding a trio of worlds and a pair of systems across the opposite side of the disk of this galaxy. It was hundreds of light years distant, but given the speed at which they had spread before, this likely meant that they were mere seasons away. Even so, Garrus was terrified scarcely a month passed before the warning chime sounded. For the first time, he had heard it outside of a system test. He walked over to where Kelsey sat, similarly dumbstruck at the computer console. The fuzzy green text on the screen indicated that the automated weapons platforms that protected their world, like so many others, had been engaged. They had detected incoming human craft, those blisteringly fast. A few minutes later, it opened fire upon them, but to their shock and dismay, the weapons platform stopped sending telemetry data less than a quarter of an hour later, suggesting complete destruction at the humans' hands in as much time as it took to say the words. He stepped up to the front entrance of their home and looked up. Fire arced through the sky, likely the last few defense platforms being shot down by the human fleet. As for the human ships, they were nearly too fast to see, streaks racing across hundreds of clicks per hour. He barely had time to shoot Kelsey a brief fearful look when there was a sudden rumble and a rush of wind and movement. Blinking, still in shock, he saw that one human craft had landed. They were the only ones on a kilometer-long street, as was the norm, so he knew they'd come for Kelsey and him. Garrus braced himself for the end, feeling sorrow well up within his heart as the knowledge that they would have his mortality cut short at such an early age. An hour passed. Opening an eye cautiously, however, there was no pain, no darkness, no death, Instead, a pair of knee-high humans were standing on their doorstep. They seemed to almost vibrate or phase between poses, but mostly held the same static, curious pose of looking up at them. Karis became aware of a whining buzz in his ears, and after a moment it grew louder and then fell quiet again. Karis just stared, glancing to see if Kalsi stirred, unsure what these humans wanted. The third time, the buzz now was much more like a low hum, and he realized that he could make out a voice speaking very quickly, too quickly for him to make out the words. Cautiously, he asked, "Are you humans? Is someone making this noise?" There was another blur of movement. The humans' torsos snapped to face each other, then their arms moving so fast they blurred. They then returned to the previous pose. This time the voice coming through was clearly artificial, but understandable. "Hello there. We are humanity, and we come in peace." Karis felt notably more at ease the latter half of their diminutive statement, but he was still apprehensive. "Well, if you remain peaceful, you're welcome to enter, I suppose." The words scarcely left his lips when the humans abruptly vanished in a blur. High-pitched whines and buzzes echoed from random corners of the room. He could see the streaks of movement from the humans seemingly ricocheting around inside their home. He suddenly felt regret at having been perhaps too hasty, but before he could speak, the humans had appeared again in front of him, their limbs and heads still showing that same oddly stuttering and ghost-like blur of movement, too fast for the eye to follow. "We thank you for your hospitality," they said again in an artificial voice. "We've been going from colony to colony to try help correct some miscommunications and misconceptions, but we realize that it may appear startling." Karis just nodded. The flashing, sudden encroachment of humans and the news reports fresh in his mind before speaking. "Well, that's good to hear. But I know there are many of my people, myself and my mate included, who feel strongly and sadly about how many lives have been lost in conflict with your species." The humans abruptly turned, and there was a loud spate of high-pitched buzz, including an odd chittering noise, before they turned back to Karis and made a gesture of apology. "I understand. True, there have been lives lost that could have been avoided, but it appears that your reports warn of hundreds dead when I believe the last count was currently 11 total." Karis blinked again, a momentary silence passing before he stammered out. That is good news indeed. But why did they think them dead, then?" The humans looked at each other before turning back to the alien looming over them. "It is customary for our military leaders to disrupt enemy communications. Typically, such communications blackout is fairly temporary, but that assumes a higher level of skill for counter-hacking. It appears there was an overestimation on our part, for which we apologize. I've already sent communications off to our command to inform them and request that the blackout be lifted." Karis was about to reiterate his thanks when the human blurred and appeared beside his carving. "Wonderful work. The shores, I take it," the human said, and through the quick gesture, Karis could see the human's speared point towards the carving tools that he had at his lower set of manipulator limbs. He nodded. "It is. Were it not for a few blemishes here and there, it might be one of the finest carvings of my generation." The human nodded. "It is beautiful. Reminds me of a sculptor from my homeworld." The alien nodded politely, but within, Karis was somewhat annoyed by the comparison. The oldest a human could achieve was scarcely past 100 years until very recently, and even then, a century and a half was still an absolute limit. Factoring in a few lost decades for youth and old age, humans had perhaps 120 to 130 years of working achievement that they could possibly call upon. Well, he had spent that long on this carving alone. However, as he watched, the human activated an incredibly tiny screen on his wrist, creating a faint blue glowing rectangle suspended in the air in front of him. From here, both the rectangle's image and the human's limbs became a blur of motion as the human began searching for what they were looking for. But it was only a span of a few heartbeats later when the human seemed to settle on something. Reaching over to the glowing suspended rectangle of light again, the human made a gesture and abruptly an image expanded, ballooning until it was nearly the height and width of Karis's own immense body. The figure was a carving, a man. His face turned slightly. The muscles and detail were perfect, or at least as perfect as Karis could tell. Alongside the image were several zoomed-in close-up shots of various details across the piece, and with each one Karis felt more and more lightheaded. But it was the final close-up that truly took his breath away. It was the carved figure's hands clutching a sheet of fabric that bulged and hung exactly like a fabric should, rendered with exquisite detail. It was a technique that Karis himself hoped to one day capture, as only one of the master carvers he had apprenticed under had ever managed to achieve such a feat of precision, expression, and carving mastery. The sun had begun to rise the next morning when he finally snapped out of his momentary shock and uncertainly asked, "And this was from just a normal human, with a normal human lifespan?" The artificial voice filtered back, "This, yes, just a normal human. Most consider him a master sculptor, and he's part of a group colloquially called the Old Masters." Garrus did his best to seem nonchalant as he asked exactly how old this old master was, but he could feel a release of tension from within his chest as he replied that the original was something called an Italian from approximately 2,000 years earlier. Doing his best to avoid being rude, Garrus stated, "Well, 2 millennia is certainly a fast turnaround time for both gaining skill and producing such a work, but the skill is to be commended regardless." The human responded with more of a chittering sounds before the voice came back. "Oh, I'm sorry, you must understand. The artist, the Italian who made the original, died at 88 years of age." Garrus felt like someone had just kicked his legs out from under him. "Less than a century. Less than a century. And they produced that. There is no blemish on it. And you say he produced this even with him working so far into his old age?" Again, a more strange chittering sounds, and the humans replied, "Oh, sorry, you misunderstand. That was when he passed away. He carved this piece, the inspiration, when he was a mere 26 years old." Garrus felt something akin to nausea from the mountain of impossibility that was producing mastery that took 1,000,000 years and a quarter of a century, less than that, even, if one considered that human morphology and strength would likely not permit carving such works until a decade or more into their life. It was astonishing, and yet it still brought a tear to Garrus's eye as he mourned for the human he had never met, who had such beauty and exquisite expression. He had only decades to learn, less than a century to live. Imagine what he could do with an epoch. What sublime perfections could he coax forth under the birth, life, and death of a star? Garrus closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to try and calm himself. He opened them, giving the humans in the moonlight a small smile. "It is a shame that he lived so," he paused, mentally adjusting to the human frame of reference for time spans. "Long ago, as I would have liked to have studied as his apprentice." "Well," said the human after a brief burst of discussion, "it's certainly not the only piece of his that we have, nor the only record of his life. He was born well after the advent of writing and written records. Many of those lessons of his knowledge have not been truly lost." Garrus's eyes widened in shock. In his astonishment, he asked, Might I have a chance to read through them?" "Of course," said the human, displaying bare teeth despite the clearly meant to be a smile, "on the condition that any lessons you learn, you are willing to teach the next generation as well." Garrus nodded. After patiently transferring the information to his own terminal, he opened up the file on the glowing green monitor and began to read. The initial books and documents he had been given took him a year to complete, an eye blink and a drip of nourishment when he hungered for so much more. But then he had reached out, and the humans, now staunch and friendly allies, all miscommunications having been resolved or averted, gladly sent him orders of magnitude more. These, in turn, took several decades to read. Still a mere trickle. Before he had scraped the bottom, finding the end of all what humans had written upon the long-dead sculptor, every work had been committed to memory, every piece of sculpture and painting analyzed and appraised. And if Garrus were being honest with himself, all excuses having been exhausted. Finally, he turned back to his block of marble. He had left the comfortable ease of soapstone behind, as he wished to truly challenge himself and prove that he was up to the challenge accomplished by a mere human. When he had asked that first human how they did it, doing, creating, and living in so much little time, the human just smiled and told him, "We are blessed that the candle burns half as long, burns twice as bright." Garrus planned for nearly 5 years, but it was still work at breakneck pace compared to the leisurely centuries it had taken before. And so, with confidence and exhilaration he had never felt while crafting before, he gathered his chisel and hammer. He, too, could see the angel in the marble, and now he just had to carve until he set it free. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.